Good evening and a very warm welcome on behalf of Milim to this evening's presentation. Our online series of talks and conversations continues with our guest, historian and journalist, Gershom Gorenberg, and I'll introduce Gershom in just a moment. Welcome wherever you are in the UK and indeed wherever you are in the world. And I'm pleased to welcome our viewers in Canada, in Israel, and in the USA. Please ask questions. You can do this at any time you like by using the Q&A facility on your screen and typing in whatever you'd like to ask. And as ever, we'll try our best to get through as many of your questions as we can. Please also be aware of the chat facility. This will allow you to send a message or a comment to all of the other participants on this webinar, should you wish to do so. Finally, this event is being recorded and will be posted on the Milim website at milim.org.uk in the next couple of days. You'll find recordings of most of our previous events on the website, as well as details of our packed calendar of up and coming events for which you can also book tickets. And so to our speaker this evening. Gershom Gorenberg is a historian and journalist who has covered the Middle East for the past 35 years. He was born in America, grew up in California, but now lives in Israel. He's the author of several critically acclaimed books, including The Accidental Empire, The Unmasking of Israel, and The End of Days. He also co-authored the National Jewish Book Award winner, Shalom Friend, The Life and Legacy of Yitzhak Rabin. Gershom is a columnist for the Washington Post, but has also written for the New York Times Magazine, the Atlantic Review, and the New York Review of Books. He also writes in Hebrew for Haaretz. This evening, he's speaking about his latest book, War of Shadows, Code Breakers, Spies, and the Secret Struggle to Drive the Nazis from the Middle East. He joins us now from New York, where he is spending the summer teaching. Gershom, welcome to you. We're delighted to have you with us this evening, and we are all excitedly waiting to hear what you have to say to us.
Thank you so much. Just one moment as I set up the share screen, which I hope you can see now. It's a pleasure to be with you. And I'd like to start with a question for the audience, which is, how many of you have a parent or a grandparent who served in North Africa during the Second World War? You can answer me if you like via the chat function. For that matter, how many of you may have a member of your family who was living in North Africa or in the Middle East during the Second World War? Please, if that applies to you, please type something into the chat. The reason that I ask this question, and what I'd like to stress as we go forward, is that for 3 years, more than half of the Second World War, North Africa was where British and then Allied forces together fought Italy and Germany. And not only that, the real story of the decisive battle is the story of an intelligence breakthrough, and that is either missing or present only in tiny fragments in previous accounts of the war. The heroes of that story have been erased, and as I'll explain, not by accident. So to understand this, I want to take you on some time travel. This is one of those guided tours that hops from place to place, and even in this case, from one point in time to another. So stay with me and I'll remind you where we are. So our first stop is going to be central Cairo on the 1st of July, 1942, 79 years ago. If you're sitting in this cafe, the L'American Cafe in central Cairo, or you're among the department stores and apartment buildings of a city that was built to be the Paris of the Middle East, if you were looking west toward the Nile, what you would have seen is pillars of smoke rising from British General Headquarters Middle East, from the British Embassy, from RAF headquarters, from the headquarters of the Special Operations Executive, the secret agency that supported the resistance in Nazi-occupied countries. Clerks and soldiers are busy burning papers, code books, plans, maps, secret orders. The fires are so hot that some documents don't burn. The heat carries them out over the city. There's literally a rain of pieces of secret out over the over Cairo. Um, if you wanted to take cash out of the bank, you would find lines down the block. Tellers are handing out worn out bills that shouldn't be in use. There's also long lines outside the shop selling suitcases. That morning, a British code officer, a young woman by the name of June Watkins, gets off her shift in the basement of a hotel at the RAF secret code room. And on the street, she meets a South African officer who takes her to a favorite hangout of British officers at the time, Gropey's Garden Cafe. They want to get coffee. The garden of the Garden Cafe is closed, so they drink inside, but June goes down to the ladies' room and looks out the window, and she sees that out in the garden, the waiters are painting signs in German, welcoming the officers of Erwin Rommel's Axis army. The train station looks like the scene in Casablanca, in the movie Casablanca, of the Paris station on the eve of the German conquest, except without the rain. It's packed with people who want to either take trains to flee to the south, to Sudan, or to catch the overnight train east to Palestine. The British Army reserves 1,600 seats on 3 days trains for civilians who are in danger because they worked for the British in Cairo. It includes 100 Italian and German Jewish refugees who worked as translators or British agents in Cairo. But the British authorities in Palestine don't want to let them in because of the 1939 white paper that drastically limited Jewish immigration. The Turkish embassy sends a cable to Ankara, to the Turkish capital, saying, we're getting more and more Jews showing up here who want visas to Turkey. What should we do? And the answer comes back from Ankara saying, you should say no to these requests. Don't let any of these refugees in. Now, why are we reading these telegrams in English? Because they were picked up and decoded and translated by GCHQ, the government communications headquarters, the British agency at that time whose very existence was unknown to the public. If you saw The Imitation Game, you got one, I have to say, highly inaccurate version of how GCHQ broke Enigma, the German Enigma code. It also broke the diplomatic codes of 24 or more countries, by the way, including US diplomatic codes. And these Turkish telegrams were part of that haul. Everybody in Cairo knew that Cairo was facing the same fate as Paris, Belgrade, and other cities had faced earlier in the war. To understand, let's look at the map. 10 days earlier, Rommel's forces had taken the small port of Tobruk in eastern Libya. The British army appears to be in a state of collapse. In 10 days, Rommel advances forward to a tiny spot in the desert called El Alamein, just 60 miles, 100 kilometers outside of Alexandria. So let's stop for a moment and talk about this Rommel. There's Erwin Rommel wearing his signature sand goggles. Think of your associations with him. He's the most famous of the German generals. In the Second World War, he became the avatar, the embodiment of blitzkrieg, of fast mobile warfare. His memoir of his time in North Africa was called War Without Hate, portraying the war there just as a deadly game of war, which completely ignored the fact that there were civilians living in Libya, in Egypt, and in Tunisia. The post-war story that grew up around him was, and remains in large part to this day, that he was a, quote, good German, unquote. That story was partly supported by the fact that he committed suicide after he was alleged, I stress the word alleged, to have taken part in a coup bid against Hitler in 1944. So hold on to that name, Rommel. But we're still in the summer of 1942, and let's look at that map again. Palestine, to which some people from Egypt were fleeing, was actually a very uncertain refuge. As you can see on the map, here is Jerusalem. It's barely further from El Alamein than El Alamein is from Tobruk. The expectation among Jews in Eretz Yisrael, in Palestine, is that Rommel is coming. This is frightening, but the meaning of that, of Rommel's German and Italian army reaching Palestine, is actually very unclear. On the one hand, there was a report published in late June, just a few days before this, a news report from London, the first one so clear, that said that more than 700,000 Jews had been murdered in Poland by the Nazis. This was information smuggled out of Poland. It notes the use, among other things, of mobile gas chambers on trucks to commit mass murder. And with this information and other information smuggled out of occupied Europe, the World Jewish Congress issues a report that 1 million Jews have been murdered in occupied Europe as a whole. Here's how this story appeared in the New York Times on page 7, 6 or 7 paragraphs next to the Saks Fifth Avenue department store ads. The New York Times was not being anti-Jewish, it was being doubtful. It was not sure how to handle this report, and it wasn't the only media organization by far that was doubtful of these reports. For that matter, here's the editorial which appeared in Hatzofer, the religious Zionist daily in Tel Aviv. It said, it criticized the publication of these numbers. It says these items come as rumors taken from the air, passed as one informant to another, one writer to another. You shouldn't publish numbers like this because they're causing unnecessary despair. So for the 75,000 Jews in Egypt and the 500,000 or more Jews in Palestine, the fear of Rommel does not meet what we know to be, in retrospect, have been the full threat. They don't know that in Libya, under orders from Mussolini, authorities are trucking the Jews of Cyrenaica, of eastern Libya, to a concentration camp in the desert. They don't know that the SS in Berlin's headquarters are so confident of Rommel's victory, of his coming conquest of the Middle East, that they've already set up an Einsatzkommando, a mobile killing team for the Middle East. On the same day that we were talking about, the 1st of July, 1942, the commander of that team is appointed, an SS officer named Walter Rauff. And Rauff's orders are to carry out, quote, executive measures, unquote. That is to say, mass murder against the Jews of Egypt. And once Rommel advances, the target will be the Jews of Eretz Israel. And if he realizes his plan to advance onward to the Iraqi oil fields, the 25,000 Jews in Syria and Lebanon, and 100,000 more in Iraq. To understand what happens next at El Alamein, we need to travel in time again. We need to go back nearly 3 years to the first week of September 1939, the beginning of the war, to the train tracks of Poland, one train entering and one leaving. The first train leaves Berlin on the 3rd of September 1939, 2 days after the German invasion. It's headed east into Poland. It's codenamed America. It's Hitler's private train. He wants to see his army in the process of conquest. In charge of his security is his favorite general, Erwin Rommel. Rommel proudly writes to his wife that he'd been invited to sit next to Hitler at lunch and that he, Rommel, was, quote, allowed to chat for almost 2 hours, unquote, with Hitler about military problems. He says, quote, he is extraordinarily friendly towards me, unquote. Rommel worships Hitler. At the very same time, the commander of the SS and Gestapo, Reinhard Heydrich, tells the military intelligence chief of staff, the German military intelligence chief of staff, Wilhelm Conneris, that the nobility, the Catholic clergy, and the Jews in Poland must be killed. There's similar testimony of Nazi plans from an officer who served under the German chief of staff. He writes that some of what he heard about what the plans were for civilians was too terrible to write down. So I leave it to you to consider whether Rommel did or did not know what the meaning of German victories would be. In any case, Rommel is elated to watch the German invasion of Poland. It fits his idea of rapid warfare, of armored divisions breaking through enemy defenses. The thing is that for this kind of warfare, tanks are not the only weapons that are needed. You also need some way of keeping in direct touch with the commanders of the tank forces who need to be in contact with the units under them. And the only way to do this is by radio. But sending battle plans by radio is to shout them out to the world. Everybody can listen. As historian John Ferris wrote, only a traitor used radio, only a fool did not. You had to use radio, but you were practically committing treason by doing so. You have to encrypt those messages. You have to put them in some sort of code or cipher, but traditional codes and ciphers are too easy to break by the enemy. A cipher replaces one letter with another. So if Z is the letter that shows up most commonly in an enciphered message, it clearly stands for E, the most common letter in either German or in English. But what if the cipher were different for every letter? What if you typed EEE and it comes out TZQ and so on, ad infinitum, seemingly random? The solution, the way to do this, was a machine that had been invented, put on the market in the early 1920s, actually originally for business use, called the Enigma. What you see here is a keyboard. Behind it is a board with the letters of the alphabet, each with a light underneath them rather than a place for the paper. And behind that are 3 wheels with gears on them. Each wheel has 26 contacts on each side, one for each letter of the alphabet. And there are wires that inside connect the contacts on one side of the wheel with the contacts on the other side of the wheel. But they don't go straight across. The pattern is hidden. Contact number 1 can be connected to any of the other 26 on the other side. Contact number 2 to any of the 25 remaining ones. You press a letter on the keyboard, say the letter B. A signal runs through the tangle of all 3 of those wheels, through another tangle at the end, back through the 3 wheels, and then to the light board. And any letter but B lights up. As you do that, the wheels also turn. So the pattern changes. If you press B again, something else comes up. The code clerk takes down the letters as they appear and radios them. And that's the enciphered message. In 1926, the German Navy adopts Enigma, then the Army, then the Air Force. The beauty of the device is, first of all, it's the size of a typewriter. It weighs about 15 pounds. You can carry it in a command car. To decipher a message, all you have to do is type back in the encrypted message and the clear text lights up. That is, if you have a machine wired the same way and you know all of the setup, the starting positions for that day. The possible number of settings on any given day is 150 quintillion, which is the small number, because the possible number of ways to wire those wheels comes out to a number which is represented by 5 followed by 92 zeros. It's totally obvious to everyone that no one can ever test that many combinations. There's no mathematical solution. This is, to use a modern term, unbreakable end-to-end encryption. But I mentioned 2 trains that were in the focus of our looking at the Polish railroads that day. The second train leaves Warsaw on September 6, 1939, heading east away from the German forces. On board is the man who ultimately can be said to have defeated Rommel. His name is Marian Rejewski. He's 34 years old. 10 years before, he's a mathematician. 10 years earlier, working on his master's degree in mathematics, he was recruited by Polish military intelligence's Cipher Bureau. In the autumn of 1932, he's assigned to break Enigma. He applies a theory of mathematics called permutation theory. In retrospect, it's obviously the right branch of mathematics to apply to this problem, except that nobody but him thought of it. By January of 1933, Marian Rejewski has calculated the wiring inside those wheels, has broken the 5 times 10 to the 92 problem of what the wiring is. He and his 2 assistants find ways to find the daily settings. As war approaches, though, the Germans are changing the settings constantly, and Rejewski and his 2 assistants can't keep up. So in July of 1939, they invited 2 British cryptologists, 2 British code breakers from GCHQ to Warsaw to share their work. In September, as I said, Rejewski escapes via Romania, reaches France, where he continues to advise the British code breakers on how to deal with Enigma. The best British code breakers never believed that Rejewski had figured out the wiring on his own. They thought that the Poles must have stolen a German Enigma machine because it's impossible to break Enigma mathematically. But all British work on Enigma was based on Rejewski's work. Okay, we have to travel again, same date, different place. While Rejewski flees, GCHQ settles into its new estate, Bletchley Park, hideous mansion on the rail line between Oxford and Cambridge. Of course, among the people moving in is Cambridge mathematician Alan Turing. He's eccentric, yes, but the fact that he's sent on delicate missions to parallel agencies in France and the United States cast a great deal of doubt on the popular picture of him as portrayed in The Imitation Game as out of touch with other people's emotions. Based on Rejewski's work, Turing designs a giant machine that ran through Enigma settings looking for the one that could have produced a particular text. For this to work, though, you need to have a good idea of a text that appears in the messages, something called a crib. That is, it depends on the Germans ignoring basic code security and using the same phrases over and over again, and being certain that it doesn't matter because this is, once again, unbreakable encryption. Another person arriving at Bletchley Park, another Cambridge mathematician, in fact, is Gordon Welchman. Up to this point, an ethereal academician, besides coming up with a design change that actually made Turing's machine work. Welchman's really big idea is that code breaking isn't academic work anymore. It's not a job for a genius sitting alone in a small room. He proposes to turn code breaking into an industry, to divide research on new codes from the day-to-day production of breaking codes, of known codes, that it's going to be 3 shifts a day. Bletchley Park goes from a staff of a little over 100 when the war starts to thousands by the end of the war. It's effectively a high-tech startup before that term was invented. And Welchman discovers himself as a manager, a mover, a problem solver, and never returned to academia. At first, with the help of the Poles in Paris, Bletchley Park begins finding Enigma settings, reading messages. It's not a one-time break. It's not something you do once. You have to break the settings day after day, each day, for each separate network used by different branches of the German military. And then you have to translate the messages and make sense of them. Let's take another trip in time. We're jumping forward. We're still at Bletchley Park, but it's the summer of 1941. Germany has invaded the Soviet Union. British radio operators are picking up messages sent by German units in occupied territory in the Soviet Union, including the special police units. And they've broken the cipher used by the police. It wasn't Enigma, it was a different cipher. Here are a couple of the messages that were decoded. These are particularly ones from the file that was sent to Winston Churchill. This one reports that a unit has shot 367 Jews that day. Another message from the same time reports that over 3,000 Jews have been shot by various units. By the way, you'll notice that these numbers are circled in red. Churchill always used red ink, and the fact that the number is circled in red means that he took paid particular attention to the numbers of Jews that were being murdered in Soviet territory. Unlike the New York Times, Bletchley Park and Churchill knew that the massacres were real, but they didn't know the full numbers. However, the full reports are flowing to SS headquarters in Berlin. In September of 1941, Heydrich, the head of the SS, decides that shooting Jews is wearing down the SS and the police. He wants to use a more efficient method of committing murder. He wants to use trucks that transport and kill at the same time. He assigns the job of producing these mobile gas chambers to the head of the SS technical arm, a person that we've seen already, Walter Rauff. By November of 1941, Rauff has a prototype and starts production. The estimates of the number of people murdered in these trucks goes from 400,000 upward. Rauff being essentially responsible for the murder of some 500,000 people. Back on our time machine, we're still at Bletchley Park. We're going to go to April 1942. Welchman's crew has finally broken into the Enigma networks used between Berlin and Rommel's headquarters, the British Army network. And they decode this message. The message from the 24th of April, 1942 says that as part of an appreciation of the situation in Malta, it is reported from a good source that the British will not be strong enough for an offensive before the 1st of June. This is incredible intelligence. This is direct intelligence about British plans. The message is sent to the desk of a 24-year-old woman named Margaret Story. She was recruited 2 years before as an untrained clerk. Going to Bletchley Park transformed her life because GCHQ's success at decoding German messages is getting into its own commander's nightmares. What if they're decoding our messages? So in the spring of 1942, Story is appointed to the task of research specialist in charge of finding hints inside of German messages of German intelligence, of Germans reading British messages. I can't show you her picture, I'm afraid, because she left almost no trace in her life but her work. It took me months to find people who had known her. They told me, picture her as slight, as wearing dark cardigans, as always smoking, as being self-effacing, introspective, as being very intelligent, as having daunting intelligence, as having absolutely formidable intelligence, as being shy, very shy, as being the brain, as speaking 9 languages, as having a sense of humor that she treated as being labeled top secret ultra. Well, more messages follow. They end up in her reports, more and more messages from this good source in Cairo, providing the most astounding intelligence of British plans, positions, and so forth. And obviously, GCHQ wants to know who or what is the good source? How do we stop it? Well, in retrospect, the suspects would have included the Hungarian explorer and now Nazi officer Laszlo Almásy, a real person, not the fictional character described in the novel The English Patient, who may have smuggled spies into Egypt. It may be, the source may be King Farouk of Egypt, who's known, 22 years old, who's known for his pro-Axis leanings, who learned in advance of the British invasion of Persia in 1941 and warned Germany. In fact, in February of 1942, the British ambassador in Egypt carried out a coup to force Farouk to appoint a pro-Allied prime minister. But Farouk is still king, maybe he's the source. Or maybe it's a British code stolen from an embassy before the war. Before the war, MI6 counter-espionage chief, Major Valentine Vivian, wrote scathing reports on security at the British embassy in Berlin. He says his report says that the security is so poor that the Gestapo could practically break in every night and steal documents or even code books. So I will leave the true identity of the good source to the book. It's a mystery, so I don't want to provide spoilers that will ruin the reading for you, but let's jump forward in time again to June 21st, 1942, a little bit later. Rommel has just taken Tobruk, and his orders are to advance only to the Egyptian border and stop there. But then he gets a message from the good source in Cairo, and it says, if Rommel intends to take the Nile Delta, this is a suitable moment. The superb source in Cairo is telling him this is the time that he should try to take the cities of Egypt and go forward. Rommel is like a gambler who just got an inside tip. He invades Egypt. He needs to get to Alexandria because he needs a port where he can receive supplies. He actually needs to get beyond Alexandria to Palestine to take the RAF bases there, from which the Royal Air Force could attack shipping in the Mediterranean. The good source tells him that the British 8th Army will mount its final defense at Mersa Matruh, a small port along the Egyptian coast. Now, by making a very careful comparison of Allied and Axis intelligence documents, including ones that I found by locating the descendant of a key officer, the cables that he had sent from Cairo were actually in his attic, not in the archives. I was able to figure out exactly when the good source was silenced. Again, that's something that's explained in more depth in the book, but the important detail here is that on June 25th, General Claude Auchinleck, the head of Britain's Middle East Command, changes the defensive plans. He decides that the defense will take place not at Mersa Matruh, but at El Alamein. The reason for this is the narrowest spot between the cliffs of what's known as the Qattara Depression and the coast. By mounting his defense there, it means that there's no way that Rommel can go through the desert around his line, which was Rommel's preferred tactic. There's no good source intelligence from Cairo anymore at this moment. Rommel never receives the information that the British have changed their defensive plan. He breaks through at Mersa Matruh. On June 30th, his medical officer is already issuing orders about how the troops are to behave once they've taken Cairo and Alexandria. Don't drink unboiled water, don't buy ice cream on the street. There's a danger of infection, right? They're completely confident that they're moving in. Rommel reaches El Alamein and issues orders as if this is a minor mopping up operation there. Instead, he runs into a determined, well-organized British defense and is blocked. By the way, these are all messages that were intercepted and read at Bletchley Park. So he can't go forward. After weeks of fighting, he can't advance. And instead of having a port to get supplies, they have to come by truck. The supply lines are stretched hundreds of miles back into Libya. On July 20th, in the midst of this battle, Walter Rauff, the head of the Einsatzkommando for Egypt and Palestine, flies from Greece to Tobruk to El Alamein to meet Rommel's chief of staff. He still believes that he's going to deploy to carry out the SS plans. He's told, our advance on Cairo has to wait. We're short on supplies, especially fuel. So Rauff's team waits in Athens for Rommel to take the Nile. It never happens. El Alamein was literally the line in the sand. That's where Rommel was stopped. It took till November before the British, under a new commander, Bernard Montgomery, drove the Axis forces back. And Churchill would call that the end of the beginning of the war. But I would argue that the real end of the beginning was July, because once Rommel was stopped short of Alexandria, his army was doomed. A constant stream of deciphered Enigma messages, declassified only in recent years, show that his army was short on fuel, food, and supplies. It can't reach Alexandria. Hitler won't let them retreat. And the point here is that the victory in the secret war was the key to the victory at El Alamein. Rommel and the SS under Rauff will never reach Cairo or Tel Aviv. Rommel naturally never knows of the role of Rejewski, of Welchman, of Turing, and Margaret Story in his defeat. Why did this story remain secret? Well, there was an order issued on the 19th of April, 1945, just before VE Day, to everybody, the small, relatively small group of people who knew the secret of breaking Enigma. And what they were told is, you must keep this secret for the rest of your lives. This is not just a secret to the end of the war. A number of reasons are given, but the first and most important reason is the one that you see here, taken directly from the order that was sent out. No possible excuse may be given to the Germans to think of anything but that their complete defeat was by force of arms. And the reason for this was that after the First World War, all sorts of conspiracy theories had started in Germany, that there'd been some sort of treason, some sort of stab in the back that was responsible for the fact that the Germans had lost, which led to the confidence to try again. It was crucial psychologically in the eyes of the British leadership to make sure that the Germans believed that they'd been defeated completely by force of arms on the battlefield, and knowing the role of intelligence might crack this sense of complete defeat and lead to a third war. So they are told that everybody who knows the secret is told that essentially you fought the War of Shadows, you played an extraordinary role in victory, and for the victory to last, history must forget you. You may never speak. So I'm going to close with several thoughts. First of all, Enigma could be broken because human beings designed it, and another human being looked at the problem differently, and because people took shortcuts. The flaw in the machine was the human beings who used it. Technology has changed an immense amount since then, but people are people, and therefore perfect security keeps failing. The second thing is that were it not for the victory at El Alamein, the SS would have reached Cairo and Palestine. This is one part. There's more that I describe in the book in War of Shadows of how the usual picture of the Holocaust as being something that only happened in Europe is too narrow of a picture. And also, this is only a small sampling of the intrigues, the hidden part of the war in the Middle East that would shape the Middle East after the war. Just as one example, that 1942 coup in Egypt discredited King Farouk and served as the catalyst of the 1952 revolution, which brought Nasser and then Sadat to power in Egypt. In telling you this, I hope to have honored those forgotten heroes, and I hope that you have the chance to read the full story in War of Shadows. In fact, if you click on your screen, you will get to a link to purchase the book. Thank you very much.
Thank
We'll
you.
take questions now.
Thank you so much, Gershom, for sharing your insight with us. The book is remarkable. I would recommend our audience read it. We are also sending links out with the emails that will reach you tomorrow. It's an amazing book. It looks quite weighty, but it's got a bit of pace when you read it, so it doesn't take quite as long as you might think. So if you've got questions for Gershom, please put them in the Q&A. You'll notice, Gershom, in the chat, lots of people are talking about their ancestry and people who fought in North Africa. We have a question from David Gould. He says, did Germany have the equivalent of Bletchley Park?
Yes and no. Every country had a code-breaking department, but the Germans was much smaller, first of all. Second of all, they suffered from too much order, too much precision. Each branch of the armed service had its own office, and they were highly compartmentalized and didn't share information. Whereas by a quirk of history, GCHQ handled code breaking for all branches of the British military, Navy, Air Force, and so forth. And that allowed synergy between people who were working on different codes. The Germans, I think, were also so certain of the security of their own codes that they didn't fully appreciate what they could accomplish in code breaking. So there were Allied codes that they broke, none of them the most secret ones on the Allied equivalent of Enigma. They obviously had intelligence sources, but they never had the level of success that the British did. The closest that they came to this, and the story of how they came to this is in the book, was acquiring the good source in Cairo.
Jeremy Topaz asks, you did a tremendous amount of work in writing the book. How long did it take?
I started in 2013 and finished in 2020, so altogether 7 years.
That's a long time. And I wondered, pretty much the story pivots around the good source. Was that your starting point, or was that something you discovered while you were researching the story you wanted to tell?
Well, it was something I discovered the idea that there was a good source was something I discovered early on. The starting point was a Shabbat lunch in Jerusalem with a friend who told me that his father, a Palestinian Jew, was a British officer during the Second World War, and that the British Army had either offered or demanded that his mother be evacuated from Palestine because of the expected Nazi conquest. She refused as a Zionist to go, to leave the rest of the community. But this brought home to me, even though I'm, I live in the field of Israeli history, I knew that there had been such a threat, but I hadn't realized that people felt the threat to be so immediate. So that was my starting point. Very early in, I ran into references, oblique references, a paragraph here, a paragraph there of this, as a very minor sub-theme of accounts of El Alamein, that the Germans had this good source in Cairo. Most of the information on it was based on post-war interviews and interrogation of German officers, and it didn't fit together. The advantage that I had, of course, is that there were documents that were kept secret for 50, 60, even 70 years after the war that were now available, especially in the British archives, but also in American, Italian, and German archives, that would allow me to get a full picture. Even that set of material was incomplete. As I mentioned before, there were crucial documents that were missing from there that I managed to trace down in other places, including in a private attic of an officer who simply took his papers home with him. And that allowed me, with all of this research, to put together a clear picture of the saga of the good source, of how that source was acquired, and of how critical it was the exact moment when the source was silenced, how that made the crucial difference at the Battle of El Alamein.
And this is the new information you bring to the story,
yes.
which adds the credibility to your book. How is this information stored and catalogued? These translated messages. There must be the most vast number of them.
There are, if you go to Kew, to the National Archives, I can never get used to the fact I'm a traditionalist. They stopped calling it the Public Record Office. In the files of GCHQ, they have these bound books of deciphered messages. Each bound volume covers like 3 days, and they're thick like this. And there's hundreds. I never sat and counted how many there were in each volume, but there's hundreds of them in each volume. And I sat and went through those. That was a key source. Around that, there are thousands of other documents that describe the workings of GCHQ, the security measures. One set of files that I discovered, which was particularly valuable, was a logbook of cables between the British and American code breakers, which was a fantastic source, not just for this story, but for others. For instance, in that book, I found a message from December 3rd, 1941, in which the British code breakers, who were actually using an American invention to read Japan's diplomatic code, they say, the Japanese embassy in London has received a message from Tokyo saying to destroy its cipher machines. This is a flashing set of red lights that Japan is about to go to war, that they're getting rid of their cipher machines because they're expecting the embassy to be taken over by their new enemy. They write to Washington, have you been receiving the same kind of message? So here we are at the first week of December. The Americans and the British know that Japan is going to war, but they aren't breaking the Navy codes, so they don't know where the attack is going to happen, which offers a whole different perspective on looking at the war in the Far East and America's entry at the war. So there were all these kinds of sources. In addition to that, as I said, there's thousands of documents that I looked at in the American archives. And then the Americans also had in microfilm huge amounts of German documents that they captured at the end of the war. So that provided another source of information. And then there were all sorts of other archives, but those are probably the major sources.
But presumably in those 7 years you were working on this, you were having to do other things as well to pay your bills, one would imagine.
Well, I continued writing a column for the different newspapers from early on. That was for the Washington Post. Since 2017, I've been teaching 1 semester a year here at Columbia University. But the thing that I was really doing day and night, and I do mean day and night, what I say 24/6 because I'm Shomer Shabbat, was this book. And I can only say that my wife and children had tremendous patience for this madman in the basement study who was up all hours of the night trying to piece together German and British and Italian documents to figure out what had happened.
And indeed, your daughters helped you with the book, as you credit
Yes.
them at the end. If you have questions for Gershom, please ask them now because we have not very long left. So don't miss the chance. The victory, the British victory at El Alamein, obviously depended to an extent, greater or lesser, on the fact the codes were cracked, probably quite a great extent, but it still does seem to be a very close thing. And I wonder really, how close did they get?
Look, when I stress that the victory depended on the intelligence, what I'm saying is that that was a necessary factor. There were many other necessary factors. Auchinleck's new decision about the defense, and of course, the incredible fighting and courage of, of the men who were there. It was a close thing. The British Army was in very bad shape by the time it retreated to El Alamein at the beginning of July 1942. It had to reorganize itself on the spot for this battle. It could have gone the other way. I mean, I think this is, we are so used to living with the spoiler of who won the war and who won which battles, that there's a tendency to look at these things as if they were predetermined. And one of the important things about writing history is to look at events as they did at the time, before the ending was known, and realize, first of all, how little the people then knew, right? I'm putting together the story from all sorts of sides, but they didn't know what was going on the German side. And second of all, that it could have come out differently. If Rommel hadn't known about the location of a particular South African division on the first day of El Alamein, maybe they would have broken through, just as one example. If Bletchley Park had not been reading the Italian naval version of Enigma, which allowed the RAF to attack the ships carrying fuel from Italy and Greece to North Africa, the fuel that Rommel so desperately needed, maybe they would have been in better shape. Again and again, you find things that were close. And here I'm going to stress something else. That determined the outcome of the war. It also determined which Jews stayed alive. In essence, Jewish survival in those years was a matter of being beyond the line at which the German armies were stopped. On the one hand, you survived if you were in London because Britain succeeded in keeping the Germans from going on beyond the coast of France. You survived if you were in Cairo or Tel Aviv because the Eighth Army stopped the Nazis at El Alamein. You survived if you were in Moscow because the Red Army stopped the Nazis before they got to Moscow. So this line, El Alamein, this line in the sand, is one of the borders of Holocaust country.
That's interesting. We have a question. Being able to read Rommel's messages is obviously helpful, but assumes that he himself is reporting his situation truthfully. Was that always the case?
That's a great question. What was not always dependable, and sometimes created a problem for the British, was reading orders to Rommel, because Rommel was infamous for ignoring orders. When Rommel first got to Africa in the spring of the spring of 1941, he had orders not just to set up a defense and not to advance, and he ignored those orders. So those orders actually didn't reach the British, but even if they'd had them, it wouldn't have made a whole lot of difference because he ignored the orders. On the other hand, the information that Bletchley Park was getting was not just from Rommel. For instance, this is a really remarkable thing. One of the advantages that the Germans had in the war is that far more than the British, they had worked out beforehand tight cooperation between their army and their air force. This was actually a huge problem for the British, is that they didn't have this level of cooperation. In order to maintain that cooperation, in every army unit, there was a liaison officer with the Luftwaffe, with the German Air Force. An Air Force officer traveled with each army unit. Now, late in the spring of 1942, Bletchley Park broke the network of Enigma used by those liaison officers. And they reported constantly in detail what had happened that day and what the plans were for the next day, because they were calling in the Air Force to do things. So those messages were like an open book of German plans, of German positions, of German lack of fuel. It wasn't just the information from Rommel.
David Goulas, did the British build any defensive lines east of El Alamein in Egypt or in Palestine?
There were preparations for defense further on. This is a subject of huge controversy of how much they expected to hold El Alamein. The answer I can see is they expected to hold El Alamein, but there were still contingency plans. There were plans for a defensive line in the Sinai, the famous Mitla Pass, which later became a crucial choke point in the wars between Israel and Egypt. There are defensive points that were built in Palestine and Syria, originally facing north, when earlier in the war, Britain's fear was the Germans would cross Turkey and invade the Middle East from the north. And so you can still go to the Carmel Mountains today above Haifa and see places, trenches and artillery positions that were built facing north for the expected German invasion in the north. And at the time of El Alamein, the British commander of the Ninth Army, the army holding the Levant, gave orders to turn those positions around to face south in case Rommel came from the south.
Finally, do you think Margaret's story is recognized for her pivotal influence in this? She's something of a heroine and an unsung hero.
I think that she's a heroine. I think that, she played a tremendously important role. I think that this is, to the best of my knowledge, there's a huge literature on this subject, but to the very best of my knowledge, this is the first time that her work has been recognized. And in fact, part of trying to find out about her was finding surviving relatives who were cousins, and she had no children. And when I told the cousins, your cousin Margaret, played this role in the war, they were, to quote one cousin, gobsmacked. They had no idea that quiet, stern Margaret played this part in the war. She was absolutely dedicated to never talking about her wartime experience. She thought it was scandalous that anybody else started talking in the 70s. She never said a word about it to anybody.
Amazing, absolutely amazing. So thank you so much for being our guest this evening. It's been really fascinating to hear you, and thank you for answering our questions. If you want to buy the book, there are links in the message we sent you to confirm your booking, and in the follow-up tomorrow you will also see it. It's highly recommended. I'm going to send you a book of some of my photography. This is Magen David Adom in action. Probably just around the corner from your home in some cases. Right. But we'll get that over to you. I'll drop you a line for your address, and that should reach you soon. Now, let me tell you a little bit about some up-and-coming events. Next week, we have Wendy Lauer joining us from California. She's speaking about her book, The Ravine. This is a 10-year-long investigation into a single photograph taken during the Holocaust. Then on the 2nd of August, Jonathan Kaufman joins us from Boston to discuss his recently published book, Kings of Shanghai, the rival Jewish dynasties that helped create modern China. The following week, on the 9th of August, we join with the Jewish Historical Society of England for a talk by Anne Kirshen about the Jewish tailors' trade unions in Leeds. Many of us Leodensians have ancestors who were tailors, so that should be very relevant to many of our audience. And then on the 16th of August, Tony Zendel is our guest with his postponed talk about his book Kosher Foxtrot, discovering and detailing Jewish connections to the golden age of dance bands. And finally, for now, on the 23rd of August, Mariel Schindler will be our guest, telling us about her book, The Lost Cafe Schindler, which is a family memoir centered on one of Innsbruck's most famous institutions. Our program continues into September and beyond. Please visit us at milim.org.uk to sign up for our regular bulletins. All our events are free, but you can make a small donation if you wish on our website, and that will help our work and the costs of providing these webinars. It remains for me to thank our guest, Gershom Gorenberg. Once again, thank you so much, Gershom.
Thank you.
Looking forward to seeing you all again at a future event. And